The words hit Edgar Slater like a bucket of ice water drawn from a January well. You will never settle down. Virginia Langley stood on the porch of her general store in Dusty Creek, Colorado, the year 1878, pressing down on the land like a boot heel on dry grass, and she said those 5 words with the calm certainty of a woman who had been burned before and had learned to read fire. Her arms were folded across her chest. Her dark eyes were steady. There was no cruelty in her voice, and that was the thing that carved into Edgar deepest, because if there had been cruelty, he could have dismissed it. Instead, there was something worse, truth, or what she believed was truth, delivered without malice and without mercy. Edgar stood in the dirt road below that porch, hat in hand, the brim crushed between his fingers, and the late afternoon sun painted everything amber and gold and still. Behind him, his horse, a lean roan gelding named Bishop, shifted his weight and exhaled through his nose like even the animal was embarrassed for him. He had just told her he wanted to stay. He had just told her that Dusty Creek felt different from every other town he had drifted through since the war ended, and sent him wandering across Kansas and Nebraska and Wyoming, and now Colorado. He had said it carefully, choosing his words like a man picking his way through a rocky creek bed, because Virginia Langley was not a woman you spoke carelessly to. He had told her that he thought he could build something here, that he thought if she was willing he could build something with her. And she had said, "You will never settle down." The silence between them stretched. A wagon rolled past on the far end of the street. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then went quiet. Edgar looked at Virginia and Virginia looked back at him, and for just a fraction of a second something flickered in her expression that was not quite the certainty she was wearing, something that looked more like fear hiding beneath a mask of conviction. But then it was gone. "I have seen your kind before, Edgar Slater," she said quietly. "I have watched men like you blow into this town with warm words and restless eyes and then blow right back out again when the next horizon called. My mother watched my father do it. I watched my husband do it. I will not watch it happen to me a 3rd time." Edgar opened his mouth. She turned and went inside, and the door clicked shut behind her with a finality that was louder than a gunshot. He stood there for a long moment, hat still crushed in both hands, the amber light fading around him. Then he put his hat back on, tilted the brim against the lowering sun, and looked at the vacant lot next to Virginia's general store. It was nothing but dead grass and cracked earth and a rusted wagon wheel half buried in the dirt. A piece of land that nobody had done anything useful with in years. His jaw set. He walked over to the vacant lot, crouched down, and pressed his palm flat against the dry soil. It was not impossible. Hard, yes. Neglected, yes, but not impossible. He would plant a garden, not to spite her, not to prove her wrong in the way a petty man proves someone wrong. He would plant it because a garden was the most permanent statement a wandering man could make. A garden said, "I intend to be here when these seeds break ground. I intend to be here when the first green shoots push up through the earth. I intend to be here at the harvest." A garden was a promise made to the soil, and Edgar Slater, whatever else anyone said about him, had never in his life broken a promise made to the earth. He had arrived in Dusty Creek 6 weeks earlier, and to understand why those 6 weeks had changed everything, you have to go back to the morning of his arrival, and to the particular way Virginia Langley looked at a man she did not yet know. Edgar had ridden into Dusty Creek on a Tuesday in mid-September of 1878 with 40 cents in his pocket, a bedroll behind his saddle, a Winchester rifle in its scabbard, and no plan beyond finding water for his horse and something hot to eat. He had been drifting since 1865, since the end of the war that had taken his brother and broken something loose in him that he had not been able to reattach. And 13 years of drifting had made him lean and careful and quiet in the way that only men who have seen too much of the world's sharp edges become quiet. Dusty Creek was a town of maybe 300 people sitting in a valley between 2 ridges of the Rocky Mountain foothills, the kind of place that was neither dying nor thriving, but maintaining itself stubbornly in the way that small Colorado towns did in those years. There was a livery stable, a saloon called the Copper Wheel, a small hotel with 4 rooms, a blacksmith, a sheriff's office, a doctor's practice, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and Virginia Langley's general store, which occupied the corner lot at the intersection of Main Street and Creek Road, and served as the beating heart of the town's commercial life. Edgar had tied Bishop at the hitching post outside the general store because it was the first establishment on the street that he reached, and because he needed flour and coffee and salt pork if he was going to camp outside town and rest for a couple of days before moving on. He had not planned to stay. He had absolutely not planned to walk through that door and find Virginia Langley behind the counter, and he had especially not planned for what happened when he saw her. She was 28 years old. She had dark brown hair pinned up at the back of her neck in a way that was practical rather than decorative, though the effect was handsome either way. She had the kind of face that was not conventionally beautiful in the soft, flowery way of portraits, but was instead striking, with strong cheekbones and direct eyes, and a mouth that suggested both humor and stubbornness in equal measure. She wore a calico dress in dark blue, and she was in the middle of writing something in her ledger when Edgar pushed the door open, and she looked up from the ledger without pausing mid-letter. "Morning," she said, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but entirely businesslike. "What can I help you with?" Edgar had talked to hundreds of storekeepers in his years of drifting. He had traded flour and salt and coffee and tobacco across 100 counters in 100 towns from Missouri to the Rockies. He knew how to conduct a transaction without wasting anyone's time, including his own. Instead, he stood in the doorway for a full 3 seconds without saying a single word. Virginia looked up more fully and waited. "I need flour," he said finally. 5 pounds, coffee, salt pork if you have it." "I have all of those things," she said, setting down her pen with the air of a woman who had been interrupted in the middle of something important but was professional enough not to show irritation about it. She came around from behind the counter and moved through her store with the ease of a person who knew exactly where everything was, which she did, because the store was arranged with a precision that bordered on the methodical. "Passing through. Planning to," Edgar said. She glanced back at him over her shoulder as she lifted a paper-wrapped parcel of salt pork from the cool section near the back wall. "Planning to, or doing it?" It was an unexpectedly sharp question, and it caught him off guard. "Excuse me. Most men who plan to pass through town do it," she said, setting the salt pork on the counter and reaching for the flour scoop. "The ones who say they're planning to are usually the ones who end up still here 2 weeks later, taking up a stool at the Copper Wheel and telling everyone they're leaving tomorrow." Edgar looked at her. "You sound like you've had that experience before." "I run the only general store in a 40-mile radius," she said, measuring flour into a cotton sack with practiced efficiency. "I have had every experience before." She tied the sack with a quick, neat knot and set it on the counter beside the salt pork. "Coffee's in the tin on the second shelf. Help yourself to 2 pounds. That'll be 40 cents for all of it." He looked at her. "That's convenient," he said slowly. "What is?" "I have exactly 40 cents. She did not smile, but something shifted briefly in her expression, a small acknowledgement that the universe had a sense of timing. "Then you are precisely funded for your needs today." He set the 40 cents on the counter. She swept the coins into her palm and into the register without looking at them and went back to her ledger. He picked up his purchases. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe and turned back because something about leaving felt entirely wrong. "Edgar Slater," he said. She looked up from the ledger. "Name," she clarified. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. "Virginia Langley." She looked back down at the ledger. "Safe travels, Mr. Slater." He went out into the morning sunshine, loaded his goods into his saddlebag, mounted Bishop, and rode to the edge of town. He got exactly to the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Dusty Creek, and then sat there on his horse for 10 minutes, listening to the water, and feeling the late September air and thinking about the way Virginia Langley had looked up from her ledger with those direct dark eyes and said his name back to him like she was committing it to some internal record. Then he turned Bishop around and rode back to town. He told himself he needed to find work for a week or two to replenish his funds before moving on, which was true, in the way that things can be technically true while also being something more complicated underneath. He went to the livery stable and spoke to the owner, a broad-shouldered man named Frank Hollies who was 3 horses deep in work and 1 hired hand short, and by noon Edgar Slater had a job mucking stalls and shoeing horses and general stable work at $2 a week plus a cot in the back room. He told himself he would stay 2 weeks. The 2 weeks became 3. The 3 became 4, then 5, then 6. And in those 6 weeks, something happened that Edgar had not anticipated, something he had not allowed himself to anticipate in 13 years of careful wandering, which was that he started to belong somewhere. Not in the dramatic way of stories, where a drifter rides in and saves a town, and the town rewards him with a parade and a deed to some land. It happened quietly, in the ordinary accumulation of daily presents. He learned which boards on the livery stable floor creaked. He learned that Frank Hollies drank 1 cup of coffee at sunrise and 1 at noon and never in between, and that if you offered him a 3rd cup he looked at you like you had suggested something indecent. He learned that the Copper Wheel Saloon had decent food and acceptable whiskey, and that the bartender, a man named Pete Dolan, had an encyclopedic memory for every piece of news that had passed through Dusty Creek in the last 15 years. And he learned Virginia Langley. He learned her the way you learn someone when you have no excuse to see them except your own desire to do so, which means you invent excuses. He went to the general store for small purchases more often than his budget strictly warranted. He lingered at the counter longer than necessary, asking questions about goods or prices or the town's history that he could have gotten the answers to anywhere else. He noticed that she came alive when she was discussing the practical logistics of running a business, and that she closed herself off when conversations veered toward anything personal, and that she had a habit of tapping the end of her pen twice on the ledger page when she was about to say something she had decided to say, but was still partially reluctant to say. He noticed that she noticed him noticing her, and he noticed that when she did, she found something else to look at very quickly. He learned her history in pieces, from Pete Dolan at the Copper Wheel, and from Frank Hollies at the livery, and from Mrs. Adeline Croft, who was the pastor's wife and the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a town newspaper. Virginia Langley had grown up in Dusty Creek. Her parents had built the general store in 1862 when Virginia was 12 years old. Her father, Thomas Langley, had been a man of great charm and restless ambition, who had loved Virginia's mother in his way but had loved the road more. And when Virginia was 16, he had packed a bag and ridden west toward California with the promise to send for them as soon as he was established. A promise that was never fulfilled because Thomas Langley had died of typhoid fever outside Sacramento in 1867, and the first they heard of it was a letter from a stranger who had found his things. Virginia had taken over the running of the store with her mother, who was a strong, practical woman who managed her grief with ledgers and inventory lists, and did not speak of Thomas Langley's abandonment in front of her daughter more than she could help. Virginia's mother died in 1874 of a lung ailment, leaving the store to Virginia, who was 24 and alone, and in possession of a going commercial concern and a very specific and deeply rooted set of beliefs about men who could not stop moving. 2 years before Edgar arrived, Virginia had been briefly married. His name was James Carver, and he was a land surveyor from Denver who had come through Dusty Creek on a surveying contract and stayed long enough to court Virginia with considerable determination and apparent sincerity. They married in November of 1876. By March of 1877, James Carver had accepted a new contract in Nevada and left with the promise that he would be back within 3 months. He was not back within 3 months. He was not back within 6. A letter arrived in August of 1877, carefully worded and deeply inadequate, explaining that the Nevada work had led to a contract in California, and that he was sorry, truly sorry, but the work was where it was, and he was a man who followed the work. Virginia had filed for divorce through the county court in December of 1877, which in the state of Colorado in 1878 was possible though not socially uncomplicated, and she had rebuilt the wall around herself with the deliberate precision of a mason who has learned from watching a previous wall fail. She was not bitter. Edgar understood this clearly after his weeks of observation. Bitterness would have been easier to work around. She was instead certain, and certainty in a person who has been hurt is a far more formidable thing than bitterness, because it is armored with the appearance of logic and it wears the face of self-protection, and it is almost impossible to argue against because the person wearing it has the evidence of their own life on their side. Edgar understood all of this about Virginia Langley. He understood her secrets, the ones that shaped her, the ones that were not hidden in the sense of being deliberately concealed, but were simply the facts of her interior life that she did not discuss with people she had known for 6 weeks. He understood all of it, and he went to her porch anyway. And he said what he said, and she said what she said, and then he went and pressed his palm against that vacant lot and felt the dry, neglected soil against his skin and made his decision. He went to Frank Holly's the next morning and told him he wanted to do some additional work to earn more money. Frank, who had an uncomplicated approach to most things, said he could have Bishop's stall cleaned twice a day instead of once, and that was worth another 50 cents a week. Edgar said that was a fine arrangement and started on it that same morning. In the afternoons, after his stable work was done, he began clearing the vacant lot. He did not ask permission from anyone, which was perhaps presumptuous, but he asked Pete Dolan at the Copper Wheel who owned the land, and Pete said it had been sitting in the county's possession since the family that originally filed on it packed up and moved to Denver 3 years ago, unpaid on their taxes, and that the county had not done anything with it since. Edgar rode the 12 miles to the county seat the following Saturday and spoke to the county assessor, a tired-looking man named Harold Webb, and asked what it would take to get a lease on the lot. Harold Webb looked at him over his eyeglasses for a long moment, the way government officials look at drifters who come asking about land rights, assessing all the ways this could become someone else's problem. "You got a connection to Dusty Creek?" Harold Webb asked. "I work at the livery stable," Edgar said. "I intend to stay." Harold Webb looked at him for another moment. "Tax value on that lot is $32. You pay the back taxes and file an intent to improve. I can put a 1-year provisional lease on it with option to buy at the end. Can't give you a deed outright until you've shown continued presence and improvement." "That's fair," Edgar said. He did not have $32. He had $4.20. He rode back to Dusty Creek and thought about it. He thought about it all through Saturday evening and Sunday morning, and on Sunday after the church service let out he walked up to Frank Holly's, who was standing in front of the livery talking to the blacksmith, a quiet man named Gus Reinhold, and he asked Frank directly if he could borrow $28 against future wages. Frank looked at him. Frank had that uncomplicated approach to most things, but he was also a businessman in the way that all people who have survived on the frontier for any length of time are businessmen, careful and risk-aware. "What for?" Frank asked. "Back taxes on the vacant lot next to the general store," Edgar said. "I want to put in a lease." Frank and Gus both looked at him. Then Frank looked at Gus. Then Frank looked back at Edgar with the expression of a man recalculating something. "You planning to put a business on that lot?" Frank asked. "I'm planning to put a garden on it," Edgar said. Another silence, a longer one. "A garden," Frank repeated. "Yes." Frank scratched the back of his neck. He looked at the sky. which was the clear, high blue of Colorado in early October, and then he looked back at Edgar with something that was maybe resignation and maybe respect, and was definitely the look of a man who had seen enough in his life not to dismiss unusual things out of hand. "I'll take it out of your wages at 50 cents a week," Frank said. "No interest, but you miss a week, the deal is done and you owe me the balance immediately." "Understood," Edgar said. They shook hands. Monday morning, Edgar rode back to the county seat and paid Harold Webb $32, 28 of which were Frank Hollis's, and signed a provisional lease and an intent to improve document, and rode back to Dusty Creek with the document folded in his breast pocket against his heart. He did not tell Virginia any of this, not immediately. He did not want to tell her anything. He wanted to show her. He began clearing the lot that same afternoon. It was not small work. The lot was approximately 40 feet wide by 60 feet deep, and it had been neglected for long enough that it was thick with dead grass and volunteer shrubs, and the kind of tough, persistent weeds that grow wherever nothing else will bother to. There was the old rusted wagon wheel and 2 broken fence posts, and a pile of rotting lumber that had once been the wall of something, and was now just weather-silvered boards falling apart. He borrowed a pickaxe and a heavy spade from Frank's storage shed and got to work. Virginia would have had to have been blind not to see it. Her general store's front window looked directly onto the street, and the lot was right next to her building. The first day she watched him from behind the glass while pretending to arrange goods on the front shelf. He could see her watching in his peripheral vision. He did not look over, he kept digging. The second day she came out onto the porch. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Clearing the lot," Edgar said, not looking up from the pickaxe. "I can see that. Why?" "Because it needs to be cleared." A pause. "Do you own this lot?" "I have a provisional lease," he said. Another pause, longer this time. He glanced up briefly and saw her working through something in her expression, trying to decide which line of questioning to pursue. "What are you putting here?" she asked. He looked at her directly for the first time since she had told him he would never settle down. He held her gaze steadily. "A garden," he said. Virginia stared at him. Something moved across her face that she controlled quickly, pulling it back behind the wall. She went back inside without another word. He went back to swinging the pickaxe. He cleared the lot over the course of a week, working in the afternoons and on Sunday. He hauled the debris to the edge of town in Frank's old handcart and burned the rotting lumber in a controlled pile. He pulled the wagon wheel out with Bishop's help, a chain around the axle hub and the gelding leaning into the task with that particular patience that horses have when they understand a job. He pulled stumps and cut away dead root systems and broke up the hard upper inch of soil. By the end of the second week, the lot was clear and the soil was turned, rough and uneven but open to the sky. Now he needed to know what to plant. He rode 15 miles east to a farm operated by a family named Brannigan, whose patriarch, a German immigrant named Otto Brannigan, was known in the area as the best gardener in the valley. Otto was 61 years old and walked with a limp from a thrashing accident 20 years prior, and he greeted Edgar at his gate with the cautious courtesy of a man who had learned to be careful with strangers and generous with neighbors once trust was established. Edgar explained what he wanted to do. He explained the soil type, the elevation, the exposure to sun, the fact that October was already well underway and winter would be coming. He asked what could be established before the frost and what would need to wait until spring. Otto Brannigan listened to all of this with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, and when Edgar finished talking, Otto turned and walked toward his barn without a word. Edgar stood at the gate for a moment, uncertain whether he was being dismissed or invited, and then followed. Otto led him through his barn and into a storage area at the back where he kept his seeds. Wooden boxes lined one wall, each labeled in careful German script, each containing paper envelopes or small cloth pouches of seeds sorted by year and type. There were onion sets and garlic bulbs and the dry, papery casings of dormant perennial flowers and the hard, earthy spheres of tulip bulbs that had no business being planted in Colorado, but were there anyway because Otto Brannigan had brought them from Germany and refused to give them up. "Winter garlic," Otto said, pointing to a box. "Plant it now before the ground freezes solid. It sleeps through winter and comes up in spring." He moved to another box. "Spinach, very cold hardy. If you get the seeds in the ground while the soil is still above 30 degrees, it will germinate before the snow comes and then go dormant and come back strong in February or March." He picked up a paper envelope, squinted at the label. "Kale, same idea, hardy greens, they come back from under snow like nothing happened." He turned to Edgar. "You are doing this for a woman," Otto said. It was not a question. Edgar was quiet for a moment. "I'm doing it to prove I'm staying," he said. "Which is for a woman," Otto said, and there was no judgment in it, only precision. "Yes," Edgar said. "Yes, I suppose it is." Otto nodded. He began selecting envelopes and pressing them into Edgar's hands one by one. Garlic bulbs wrapped in a piece of burlap, spinach seed, kale seed, a packet labeled something in German that Otto translated as winter hardy onions, a pouch of something he called a perennial herb mix, thyme and sage and oregano, that would not produce this season but would establish roots before the frost and come back vigorously in spring. A small bundle of strawberry runners, already dormant, that he said to plant along the south-facing edge where they would get maximum sun. "This is too much," Edgar said, looking at the collection gathering in his arms. "You need to fill a 40 by 60 lot," Otto said dryly. "You have very little." He also gave Edgar a small pamphlet he had written himself in English, a careful guide to soil preparation and planting depths and spacing, along with a hand-drawn map of his own garden showing how he arranged companion planting to reduce pest damage. Edgar tried to pay him. Otto waved the money away with a gesture of profound German dismissal. "Come back in spring and tell me how it went," Otto said. "That is my payment." Edgar rode back to Dusty Creek with his arms full and his heart full, and began planting the following morning. He worked with a precision that surprised even himself, following Otto's pamphlet carefully, pressing each garlic clove into the prepared soil at the recommended depth, spacing the rows along the lines he had measured with a piece of cord. He planted the spinach in careful lines along the north edge, where a low wooden border he had built from salvaged boards would protect the seedlings from wind. He put the herb plants along the strip of ground closest to Virginia's store wall, where they would get the most shelter. And something strange happened as he was planting, something he had not expected and could not entirely explain. The work settled something in him. Not the restlessness exactly, because the restlessness had not entirely disappeared and he was not sure it ever would, but it quieted, the way a river goes quiet when it finds its proper channel. He pressed seeds into the earth and thought about the fact that these seeds would still be here in February when the snow was on the ground, alive and dormant and waiting. He thought about the fact that the garlic would come up in April while the rest of the country was still cold, green and stubborn and permanent. He thought about Virginia. He thought about her dark, direct eyes and her precise hands in the ledger, and the way she had said his name the first time, like she was committing it to some internal record. He thought about her father and her husband, and the particular shape of the wound that had been left in her by men who moved. He thought about the fact that the thing she needed was not his words. She had heard enough words from men who moved. She needed something she could see with her own eyes in the ground, something that said, "I was here yesterday and I am here today and I will be here tomorrow and here is the living proof of it, green and growing in the dirt outside your window." He planted for 3 days. On the 4th day Virginia came out of her store, walked down her porch steps, crossed the 3 feet of dirt between her building and the lot, and stood at the edge of what was now a carefully tended, fully planted garden bed. Looking at it with her arms crossed in the particular way she crossed her arms when she was fighting something internally. Edgar was on his knees, pressing the last of the strawberry runners into the south edge. He was aware of her the moment she appeared, but he did not stop what he was doing. She stood there for a full 2 minutes. He could hear her breathing. "Garlic," she said finally, looking at the lines of planting markers. "Yes. Spinach and kale. Yes. And those," she pointed to the herb strip along the wall. "Thyme, sage, oregano. They will not show much until spring, but they will come back." Another silence. "Edgar," she said. He looked up at her. She was looking at the garden, not at him, and her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it, which was still not very unguarded but was more than nothing. There was something in it that was not quite softness, because Virginia Langley was not a soft person and Edgar would not have wanted her to be, but it was something adjacent to softness. It was the look of a person confronting evidence they have been actively trying not to see. "You got a lease on this land," she said. It was not a question this time either. She had clearly done some asking around. "Provisional," he said. 1 year option to buy. That costs money." "It does. You do not have much money." "No," he agreed. "I borrowed some from Frank Holly's. I am working it off." She finally looked at him directly. There was something complex moving in her eyes, something that was not yet trust but was a kind of bewildered, reluctant reassessment. "Why?" she said, just that word. "Why?" He got up off his knees and brushed the soil from his hands. He looked at her steadily, the way he had looked at her on the road after she had shut the door on him, with that same quiet, patient certainty that was not aggression but was not apology either. "Because I mean it," he said, "and the only thing I know how to say that louder than words is with something I plant in the ground." Virginia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the garden. Then she looked at him again. "It is October," she said. "Half of this will be buried under 2 feet of snow by December. And it will come back in March," Edgar said. She exhaled, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh, something in between. She uncrossed her arms, which was a small thing but felt significant. She looked at the garden one more time with those dark, calculating eyes. "I need to restock the flour bags," she said, and walked back up to her porch and into her store. He stood in the garden and allowed himself one small, private smile. It was not a declaration. It was not a change of heart. It was Virginia Langley declining to dismiss him, which was not the same as acceptance but was a crack in the wall. And Edgar Slater had learned enough in his years of wandering to understand that a crack in a well-built wall is not nothing. He went to dinner at the Copper Wheel that evening and ate a plate of beans and cornbread, and drank a single whiskey and felt, for the first time in 13 years of drifting, something that he tentatively and cautiously identified as hope. Winter came to Dusty Creek in November with the unapologetic efficiency of Colorado altitude. The first snow fell on the 9th of November, a light dusting that melted by afternoon, but left the world smelling clean and cold and mineral. The second snow, a week later, stayed, and by the end of November the ground was under 4 inches and the temperature was dropping to single digits at night. Edgar went to look at the garden every morning, despite the snow, despite the cold, because there was something he needed to see or not see, and what he needed not to see was failure. The garden lay under its blanket of white and was invisible, which was not failure. It was precisely what was supposed to happen. The seeds were doing their work underground, in the dark and cold, making themselves ready for a spring they could not yet know was coming. He thought this was a useful way to think about other things as well. He and Virginia had reached a careful equilibrium in November. He came into the store for supplies and she served him, and they talked about things that were practical and present, the weather, the inventory, the town's news, and there was a warmth developing under the businesslike surface of these conversations that was not acknowledged but was felt by both of them. The way you can feel a fire through a wall before the warmth actually reaches you. He began helping her without being asked. Not in a pushy way, not in the way of a man inserting himself where he has not been invited, but in the quiet, observant way of someone who notices what needs doing and does it. He fixed the loose board on her porch steps that she had mentioned almost in passing to Mrs. Adeline Croft while he happened to be standing nearby at the post office. He came by one morning with a new hinge for her back storeroom door, which had been hanging crooked, and replaced it in under 10 minutes while she watched from the doorway. "I did not ask you to do that," she said. "No," he agreed, testing the door on its new hinge. "But it was bothering you." She looked at the door for a moment. "It was," she admitted. "How did you know?" "You glance at it every time you walk past it," he said. "You have since the first time I came in here 6 weeks ago." A pause. She looked at him with a new quality of attention, the kind a person gives when they realize they have been more carefully observed than they knew. "You notice things," she said. "I have been moving through the world a long time," he said. "You learn to pay attention." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people who pay close attention do it so they can leave at the right time," she said. "Some do," he said. He picked up his tools and gave her the simple truth as plainly as he could. "I am doing it so I know when I am exactly where I should be." He walked out before she could say anything, because he had learned that there were moments when the most powerful thing you could do was let a statement stand without following it with anything. November deepened. December came. Christmas in Dusty Creek was a modest but genuine affair. The church held a service and a small social gathering afterward, with the schoolteacher, Miss Clara Hendricks, organizing the children's choir and Mrs. Croft providing a fruitcake that was legendary in the community for reasons that were not entirely complimentary. Edgar had not intended to attend the Christmas social. He was not much of a church man, not since the war had rearranged his relationship with the Almighty into something more questioning and private than public worship accommodated. But Frank Hollis told him directly that everyone in town was expected at the social, that it was one of those community obligations that was not quite mandatory, but that your absence would be noted in a way that created persistent social awkwardness. And Edgar decided that persistent social awkwardness was a complication he did not need. He went to the social. Virginia was there in a dress he had not seen before, a deep burgundy that made her look like something the lamplight was specifically interested in, and she was talking to Mrs. Croft and 2 other women when Edgar arrived, and she looked over and saw him, and the expression on her face did something he had been waiting for. She smiled. It was a real smile, not the controlled, professional acknowledgement she gave to customers or the carefully managed politeness she used in social situations. It was a small, warm, genuine smile that was there for only a second before she caught it and redirected her attention to the women she had been talking to, but it was there. Edgar had seen it. He stored it somewhere careful and private, and did not ruin the moment by doing anything conspicuous with it. He accepted a cup of Frank Hollis's spiked cider, and positioned himself in the room in a way that was casual, but that reduced the distance between himself and Virginia by approximately half. It took about 40 minutes for them to end up near each other at the refreshment table, which was not accidental on either of their parts, though both of them were making reasonable efforts to make it look accidental. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said. She was loading a small plate with slices of dried apple and a piece of Mrs. Croft's legendary fruitcake, which she had accepted politely and clearly had no intention of eating. He looked at the fruitcake on her plate. "How committed are you to eating that?" She looked at it too. "Deeply uncommitted," she said, "but Mrs. Croft is watching." "She is talking to Reverend Croft and looking the other direction," Edgar said. Virginia subtly redirected the fruitcake to the edge of the table where it could be forgotten without anyone being implicated. "You are surprisingly useful," she said. "I have my moments," he said. She looked at him sideways with a quality of amusement that was new territory in their relationship. The first time she had let humor come into her interactions with him in anything other than an oblique, deniable way. They stood at the refreshment table longer than either of them needed to, talking in low voices about the town's history, and some of the more eccentric stories Pete Dolan had shared about Dusty Creek's early years. And Virginia told him about the time in 1869, when a traveling theatrical troupe had been stranded here for 3 weeks by a blizzard, and had put on 4 consecutive performances of something billed as Shakespeare, though apparently bearing only a passing resemblance to the actual texts. And the way she told the story made Edgar laugh, a real laugh that he had not heard from himself in longer than he could easily remember. She laughed, too, at her own story, a bright and genuine sound that she seemed slightly surprised to have made. They looked at each other in the aftermath of that laughter, and for a moment something was entirely clear between them, something that neither of them had to say because both of them were already feeling it, and it was vivid and a little terrifying and entirely real. Then Mrs. Croft appeared at Virginia's elbow to discuss the post-Christmas inventory order, and the moment closed, but it did not disappear. It remained as a presence in the room between them for the rest of the evening. Edgar walked home through the cold Colorado night with snow crunching under his boots, and the stars very bright and very close at this altitude, and he thought about a woman's laugh in a lamplight room, and the way it had felt like something thawing. January and February were hard months. January in particular hit Dusty Creek with a ferocity that made the November snows look like suggestions. The temperature dropped to 30 below on the worst nights, and the wind came down out of the mountains with a cutting persistence that made outdoor work miserable, and any venture beyond the necessities of life feel inadvisable. Edgar spent these months doing what he could indoors at the livery, reading during the evenings by the light of a kerosene lamp, and coming into the general store as often as he could manufacture a reason to. He was not the only one coming in more often than strictly necessary. He noticed that other townspeople were doing the same, because Virginia's store, with its warm stove and good coffee, was the most comfortable gathering place in Dusty Creek outside the Copper Wheel, and Virginia had a gift for managing a room that made people feel both welcome and not overstayed. She moved through her store during these gatherings with a natural ease, refilling coffee cups and contributing to conversations and managing transactions all at once. She was remarkable. Edgar watched her and thought this simply and without complication. She was a remarkable person, self-sufficient in a way that was not brittle but was earned, a person who had built her own stability from the ground up on a foundation of loss and had made something genuinely strong out of it. He also noticed the moments when the remarkable self-sufficiency showed its cost, the evenings when the store was closed and the lights went dark early, and the town was quiet, and he would sometimes see from a distance the single lamp burning in her apartment above the store, and he would think about what it cost to be that alone by choice, what a specific and daily kind of courage that required. February brought what Edgar had been waiting for. He went out to the garden on the 15th of February, a clear day with the temperature almost reaching 30 degrees in the afternoon sun, and he saw it. Along the south-facing edge where the strawberry runners had been planted, barely visible but present, the beginning of green. Tiny, fragile, impossibly determined green pushing up through soil that was still cold and half-frozen, and along the north edge where the spinach had been sown, more of it. 3 or 4 small seedlings, no bigger than a fingernail, brave and unambiguous. His throat tightened. He went to the general store. Virginia was behind the counter doing the ledger. She looked up when he came in, and something in his expression made her put down her pen and give him her full attention. "Come look at something," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came around from behind the counter and got her coat from the hook by the door and followed him out. He led her to the edge of the garden and pointed. She looked. She saw the green. She crouched down, heedless of the cold ground, and looked more closely at the tiny spinach seedlings coming up through the February soil, and her face did something private and unguarded that Edgar carefully did not stare at directly. "They came back," she said softly. It was not quite a whisper, but it was quiet. "They do that," he said. "Cold does not kill them, it just makes them wait." She looked at the seedlings for a long moment. Then she looked at the strawberry runners on the south edge, where the fragile green was pressing up toward the February sun with a confidence that was either extremely naive or extremely knowledgeable about what it was doing. "You will need to build a cold frame," she said, in that practical voice she used when she was feeling something she was not yet ready to acknowledge. If the temperature drops again hard in March, it could damage these. I know, he said. I am going to build one this week. She stood up. She brushed the dirt from her skirt with both hands. She looked at the garden and then at him, and the expression on her face in the February afternoon light was the most open he had ever seen it, the wall not gone but lower than it had been, and in the gap above it something that looked very much like a feeling she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to argue against. "Edgar," she said. "Virginia," he said. And then neither of them said anything for a moment because there was too much to say, and the cold was very clear, and the tiny green seedlings were there in the brown soil being quietly definitive. "I was wrong about one thing," she said at last, with the careful precision of a person who chooses their admissions the way they choose their words deliberately. He waited. "I said the seeds would be buried under 2 feet of snow," she said. "They were," he said. "And I implied they would not survive it," she said. "You did," he said. She looked at the seedlings. "I was wrong about that," she said. He did not say anything to this because it was not about the seeds and they both knew it. She went back inside. But at the doorway she stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder, and what was in her face in that moment was not the certainty she had been wearing when she told him he would never settle down. What was in her face was something younger and more vulnerable and more truthful than certainty, something that was beginning to look, despite itself, very much like want. March arrived with a ferocity that confirmed Edgar's decision to build the cold frame. 2 weeks of alternating thaw and refreeze tested everything in the garden, but the cold frame held, and the seedlings beneath it pressed on with their stubborn vegetable conviction. And something else was pressing on with an equally stubborn conviction. Edgar and Virginia had shifted into a new rhythm. It was not courtship in any declared or formal sense, because Virginia had not given him permission to court her, and he had not asked for it, conscious that asking would invite a direct answer, and he was not yet certain that a direct answer would be the one he wanted to hear. Instead, it was a relationship that conducted itself in the register of dailiness, of small shared moments and conversations that were about practical things on the surface and other things underneath. He had taken to having dinner at the Copper Wheel 3 evenings a week, and Virginia, who sometimes had her own dinner there when she did not feel like cooking for herself alone, had begun timing her arrivals with an accuracy that could not be entirely explained by coincidence. They would share a table, not every time. Sometimes Frank Hollies was there too, or Pete Dahlin, but often enough that it was becoming a known and unremarkable fact to the rest of Dusty Creek that Edgar Slater and Virginia Langley ate together on certain evenings. Dusty Creek, for its part, was conducting itself on this matter with the restrained enthusiasm of a small town that has decided it has an opinion, but is waiting to see whether things will resolve without intervention before deploying it. Mrs. Adeline Croft was less restrained. She came into the general store one afternoon in early March and bought a box of sewing needles and a spool of thread, and while Virginia was packaging these items said, in the particular conversational tone of a woman who has been carefully building to something for several exchanges, that Mr. Slater is a very hard-working young man. I see him out in that garden every afternoon, and it is looking wonderful. Virginia kept her eyes on the packaging. He is a good worker, she agreed neutrally. Frank Hollies says he has never been late a day, never missed a shift, says he is the most reliable man he has had working for him in 10 years. Mrs. Croft accepted her package, not what you would expect from a drifter. No, Virginia said. Her voice was still neutral. Not what you would expect. Mrs. Croft looked at her for a moment with the penetrating kindness of a woman who has been paying attention to other people's hearts for 50 years. Virginia, dear, she said gently, a man who plants a garden in October and tends it through a Colorado winter is not a man who is planning to leave in the spring. Virginia looked at her, and what was in her expression was complicated and honest. He might plan to leave and leave anyway, she said, Plans and staying are different things. They are, Mrs. Croft agreed. But he is still here, and the garden is still growing. She went out, leaving Virginia standing at the counter with a look on her face that was not certainty anymore, but was not quite its opposite either. It was the look of a person engaged in a difficult internal negotiation. That evening Edgar came into the store just before closing time to buy a tin of lamp oil. Virginia was counting the day's receipts at the counter and did not look up immediately. "I have been thinking about what you said," she said, still looking at the receipts. "Last October, that you wanted to stay." Edgar set the lamp oil tin on the counter and waited. She looked up from the receipts and met his eyes directly. "I think I was unkind," she said. "Or rather, I was not unkind. I was afraid. And I used the language of certainty to say something that was actually fear, and that was not honest." He looked at her carefully. "You had good reasons to be afraid," he said. "I still have good reasons to be afraid," she said. "That has not changed. But I have been sitting here for 5 months watching you plant things in the ground and fix things that are broken and show up every single day, and I think—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly in the particular way she did when she was completing a thought she had already decided to complete. "I think it is possible I was wrong about you specifically." The lamp oil tin sat between them on the counter. The store was warm and quiet, and the kerosene lamps were burning low. "Virginia," Edgar said. His voice was steady, but his heart was doing something very complicated. "I'm not saying I am not still afraid," she said quickly. "I am saying that fear is not the same as certainty, and I confused them, and I wanted to acknowledge that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the counter slowly and without any sense of imposition and laid his hand over hers where it rested on the receipt ledger. She looked at his hand on hers. She did not move her hand away. "I am going to stay," he said. "Not I want to stay. Not I plan to. I am going to." Present tense, continuous, carrying the weight of all 5 months of daily proof. She turned her hand under his so that her palm was against his palm. Her fingers closed around his. It was not a kiss. It was not a declaration. It was a hand in a quiet store at the end of a long, cold winter, and it was everything. Spring came to Dusty Creek like a revelation. April in Colorado at elevation was not the soft green arrival of spring in the eastern states. It was a more dramatic, stop-and-start affair. Warm days and cold nights and sudden late frosts, and the particular quality of light that came when the snow was melting off the high peaks, and the sky was a blue so intense it looked almost aggressive. The garden came back. The garlic pushed up through the April soil in strong, straight lines, green and purposeful. The spinach and kale were already several inches tall and producing leaves. The strawberry runners had put out runners of their own, spreading slightly along the south edge, and the tiny white blossoms of early strawberry were opening on the warmest days. The herbs were establishing, the thyme in particular forming small mounded clumps that smelled clean and sharp when you brushed them with your hand. Edgar spent his free hours in the garden. He expanded it in April, clearing another 6 feet along the back edge and planting potatoes and beans, and a row of tomato seedlings he had started in pots in the livery stable's warm interior. He built 3 raised beds from milled lumber he bought from the sawmill outside town, and filled them with composted stable manure from Frank's heap and the best of the lot's own soil mixed together. He also went back to see Otto Brannigan, who came out to the gate to meet him with the expression of a man expecting either good news or bad news and prepared for either. Edgar told him about the winter, about the cold frame, about the garlic and the spinach and the strawberry blossoms. Otto listened. When Edgar finished, Otto said, "The woman, has she seen it?" "She has," Edgar said, and Otto said. "She held my hand," Edgar said. Otto looked at him for a moment. Then a slow smile moved across the older man's face, a private, satisfied expression. He turned and went back into his house and came back with a bundle of tomato transplants and a paper envelope of cucumber seeds and a cutting from his best basil plant in a small pot of soil. "For the new beds," Otto said, and waved away Edgar's thanks with the same gesture of profound German dismissal. In May, Edgar asked Virginia if she would like to walk with him to the creek on a Sunday afternoon. He asked it simply, not as a question freighted with implication or formality, but with the directness that had become natural between them over the months of careful proximity. She said yes. They walked to the creek along the eastern edge of town on a Sunday afternoon in late May when the cottonwood trees were fully leafed, and the creek was running high and clear with snowmelt, and the air smelled of grass warming in the sun. They walked without the particular self-consciousness of a first outing between two people who do not know each other well, because they did know each other well by now. 6 months of daily presence had seen to that, and what they were doing on this Sunday afternoon was not discovery but acknowledgement. They talked for a long time on the bank of the creek. They talked about things that had not been talked about before because they had not been ready to talk about them. Edgar talked about the war, briefly and carefully, not the combat parts because those did not need more air in the world, but about his brother, whose name was Daniel Slater, and who had died at a place in Virginia called Cold Harbor in June of 1864, and about what it had felt like to come home to Nebraska afterward and find that the place he had left did not fit him anymore, and how he had started moving and kept moving, because movement was the only state in which the grief did not accumulate too fast. Virginia listened to this with her hands in her lap and her face very still and attentive, the way she listened when she was taking something in fully. Then she told him about her father, about what it had actually felt like to be 16 and understand for the first time that the man you loved most in the world had a capacity for leaving that his love for you was not large enough to override. She told him about her mother's quiet dignity in the years after, the way she had rebuilt the family's stability through sheer practical will, and how Virginia had learned from her to see reliability not as a lesser form of excitement but as a profound form of love. She told him about James Carver. She told him more than the bones of the story that Edgar had heard from others. She told him about the particular quality of hope she had felt when she married him, the cautious hope of a person who has been hurt before and believes they have been careful this time, and about how the specific quality of his eventual leaving had been in some ways more wounding than her father's, because she had tried so hard to choose better. She did not cry while she told him this. She was not a person who cried easily. But her voice carried the weight of it, the honest, unglamorized weight of a wound that had not fully healed but had been integrated, the way you integrate a scar. Edgar listened the way she had listened to him, fully and without interruption. When she finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable but was large. "I am not your father," he said, "and I am not James Carver." "I know," she said, "but you have not had reason to believe that on the evidence you had available," he said. "No," she said, "I had reason to believe the opposite." "And now," he said. She looked at the creek for a moment, at the clean high water running over the pale stones. "Now I have different evidence," she said quietly, "and I am trying very hard to let the evidence mean what it means and not what I am afraid it means." He reached over and took her hand the same way he had taken it at the counter in the store in March, and she turned her hand in his the same way. They sat at the creek until the afternoon went golden and the shadows of the cottonwoods lengthened across the grass. Walking back to town in the early evening, their hands still linked, Virginia said in a conversational tone as though it were not an enormous thing, "I think you should come to dinner. At my apartment. On Friday evening." "I would like that very much," Edgar said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am a capable cook," she said. "I want to be clear about that before you agree." "I had no doubt," he said. "James Carver used to make a particular face when he ate my biscuits," she said. "James Carver," Edgar said with complete conviction, "was a fool in many respects." There was a pause. Then she laughed and he laughed, and they walked the rest of the way back to Dusty Creek in the long gold evening with their hands together, and something between them that was no longer nameless or uncertain, but was tender and real and building with the unhurried deliberateness of something planted deep. The Friday dinner, was the beginning of a new phase of things. Virginia's apartment above the store was small and impeccably ordered and quietly personal, in a way the store was not, with a framed botanical print above the bookshelf, and a collection of small rocks on the windowsill that she admitted to having been gathering since she was a child, because she liked the way the high country quartz caught the light. She cooked a beef stew with root vegetables and fresh kale from the garden, which Edgar noted with a particular warm feeling, and biscuits that were genuinely excellent and said so to her directly. James Carver was a fool in many respects, she said, without looking up from the stew. They ate at her small table by the window overlooking the street, and the evening went dark outside, and the lamps were warm, and they talked about everything, and nothing with the ease of two people, for whom the other person's company has become necessary and natural. He told her about places he had been in his years of drifting, the things that were beautiful about Montana in autumn and about the canyon country of Utah in spring, told them not as an advertisement for the road, but as the memories of a person who had moved through the world and was now sitting still by choice. He helped her clear the dishes afterward, which seemed to surprise her briefly, and she showed him the botanical print which had been her mother's, and he looked at it carefully because it had been her mother's. At the door when he was leaving, she looked at him in the lamplight with that direct, dark gaze and said, "I am glad you did not ride on. I am glad you gave me sufficient motivation to stay," he said. "The 40-cent coincidence," she said. "The 40-cent coincidence," he agreed. She smiled at him fully, without catching it or pulling it back, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life, and he told her so, simply and without flourish, and the smile stayed on her face all the way through the small silence that followed. He went down the stairs and out into the May night with the smell of beef stew and kale and lamp oil, and a particular kind of happiness that he had not known was possible. June brought the garden into its full early summer glory. The garlic scapes curled up from the plants in their elegant spirals, and Edgar cut them as Otto had instructed, snapping the curl to redirect the plant's energy into the bulb underground. The spinach was producing prolifically, and Virginia was using it in her cooking, which meant that the garden was literally feeding her, which was not lost on either of them as a kind of metaphor that did not need to be named. The tomatoes were setting fruit, small hard green globes that would not ripen for weeks but were unmistakably there. The beans were climbing the poles he had set for them. The cucumbers were vining along the ground and producing their quick, cheerful yellow flowers. Edgar had, over the spring, made the garden beautiful as well as functional. He had bordered it with the flat creek stones that were plentiful along the eastern bank, creating a clean, low edging around each bed. He had planted a row of sunflowers along the back fence he had built, and they were chest height now and climbing, their faces tracking the sun with their steady, loyal habit. Virginia came out into the garden in the mornings before the store opened, sometimes. Not every day, but with increasing frequency. She would stand at the edge with her coffee cup and look at what was growing, and sometimes she would crouch down to look at something closely, a new blossom, a beetle, a curious leaf curl that she would ask him about. He would explain, and she would listen and ask further questions, and these morning conversations in the garden were some of the most intimate moments in Edgar's experience of her, because she was fully present in them, undivided, the store not yet open and the ledger not yet out and the day not yet making its demands. In June he took her hand while they were standing in the garden looking at the first ripe strawberry of the season, a single small red one hanging from its stem in the morning light, and she looked at the strawberry, and then at him, and then she leaned up and kissed him. It was not a long kiss or a dramatic one. It was decisive and unhurried and entirely mutual, and it tasted like coffee, and it lasted just long enough to be definitive. And when they separated, there was a silence in which both of them understood that the last of the wall was down. "I grow strawberries, apparently," Edgar said. "You do," she agreed, and there was laughter in her voice, and underneath the laughter something warm and steady and thoroughly unafraid. He picked the strawberry and handed it to her. She ate it with the expression of someone eating something that tastes exactly as good as they hoped it would. "We need more of these," she said. "I will plant more in the fall," he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes in the morning garden light, and what was in them was not the remnant of fear or the edge of uncertainty or the careful evaluation of evidence. What was in them was something that had come through all of that and arrived, finally, at something simple and true and lasting. "Edgar," she said. "Virginia," he said. "I think I am in love with you," she said, with the direct, unornamented honesty of a person who has decided that the scariest thing is not the vulnerability of saying it, but the cost of not saying it. He held her gaze for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the beautiful, terrifying weight of it. "I know I am in love with you," he said. "I have known it since February when I saw the first green come up out of that frozen ground, and my first thought was that you needed to see this." She stepped closer to him in the garden in the June morning, and he put his arm around her, and she put her head briefly against his shoulder, and they stood among the tomatoes and beans and sunflowers, and it was entirely perfect in the way that things are perfect when they have been earned through patience and honesty, and the particular kind of courage that love requires of people who have been hurt. Summer passed in a new kind of richness. They were a known fact in Dusty Creek now, Edgar Slater and Virginia Langley, and the town received this fact with the warmth of a community that had watched both of them carefully and arrived at the opinion that this was right and good. Frank Hollis shook Edgar's hand at the livery one morning with a completely unjustified air of personal credit. Mrs. Croft appeared at the general store more often than ever and looked at both of them with a satisfaction that she made no effort to conceal. Pete Dolan at the Copper Wheel bought them each a drink one evening and made a brief and unexpectedly moving toast that involved neither excessive sentiment nor inappropriate humor, which was a remarkable achievement. Edgar was still at the livery, still working off the loan from Frank, still sleeping in the cot in the back room, but the shape of his days had changed fundamentally because they were organized now around a different center of gravity. He had a place he belonged. He had a person who mattered to him in a way that had reorganized everything. He also had a garden that was producing abundantly enough that Virginia had begun selling surplus vegetables through the store, the kale and spinach in spring, the beans and tomatoes and cucumbers in summer, an arrangement that had not been explicitly planned, but had emerged naturally from the fact that the garden was producing more than two people could eat. In August, he sat down with Frank Hollis and had a conversation about what the future might look like, which was the kind of conversation he had never had with an employer in his life, because, until now, there had not been a future worth planning for. Frank, who was 63 and had no children and whose wife had died 8 years previously, turned out to have been thinking about his own future with more specificity than Edgar had expected. The livery was Frank's life, but it was a young man's work, and Frank was not a young man anymore, and the particular toll of the heavy daily labor was making itself felt in his joints with increasing persuasiveness. They talked for 2 hours one evening after the stable was closed and the horses were fed. Frank said that what he was looking for was a way to step back from the heavy work while keeping an interest in the business. Edgar said that what he was looking for was a stake in something lasting. By the end of the conversation, they had the outline of an arrangement that would see Edgar taking over the day-to-day management of the livery in exchange for a percentage of ownership that would increase each year against his labor, with Frank retaining a senior interest and the right to stay involved at whatever level his health permitted. It was not a deed. It was not a large stake, but it was a beginning. Edgar told Virginia about it that evening at the Copper Wheel, and she listened to the outline of the arrangement with the attention of a businesswoman evaluating a business proposition, which she was. But there was also in her listening the particular quality of attention that a woman gives when she hears the man she loves making plans for a future in the place where she lives. When he finished, she said, "Frank's rate for shoeing is 2 cents below the going rate in the valley. If you are taking on management, you should bring it up to market value." Edgar looked at her, "That is your response," he said. "It is good business advice," she said. "It is excellent business advice," he said. "That is not what I was asking." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, which she had become comfortable doing in public in the way that people become comfortable with tenderness once they have decided to stop being afraid of it. "I think it is wonderful," she said, "and I think Frank Hollies is getting the better end of the arrangement by a considerable margin." He looked at her in the copper wheel lamplight. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him steadily. She had learned by now to read his preparation for important statements, and she had learned to meet them with the directness they deserved. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. A full silence, the kind that is full of everything that has been between them over the months of daily proof and garden mornings and honest conversations and held hands and the particular, complete understanding they had arrived at of each other. "Ask me then," she said very quietly. He held her gaze. "Virginia Langley," he said, with the same simplicity he had put into everything that mattered between them. No flourish and no performance, just truth. "I am going to stay here. I have planted things in the ground that will come back for years. I have a stake in a business that I intend to build into something real. I have been here through a Colorado winter, and I am still here and the garden is still growing. I love you with a completeness that has surprised me, and that I intend to make the organizing fact of my life from this point forward. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for one long moment, and in that moment the last trace of what she had feared, the dark past of leaving men and abandoned promises, passed through her expression fully and completely and then moved on, the way a cloud moves through a clear sky and leaves the blue behind. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Edgar Slater." He brought the ring from his breast pocket. It was not a large ring. He had commissioned it from the jeweler in the county seat. A simple band of gold with a small garnet stone, a deep red that reminded him of the burgundy dress she had worn at the Christmas social when she had smiled at him fully for the first time. He had spent more than he comfortably had on it because Virginia Langley deserved something made with thought and not with convenience. She looked at it in his palm and then at him, and then she held out her hand, which was the most deliberate and direct and perfect thing she had ever done. He put the ring on her finger. Pete Dolan, from behind the bar, said, "Well, it is about time," in a tone that suggested this had been the opinion of the copper wheel for some months, and the four other patrons present responded with the kind of brief, sincere applause that comes from people who are genuinely pleased and not performing it. They were married in October of 1879, exactly 1 year after Edgar had pressed his palm against the neglected lot next to Virginia's store and decided to put something permanent into the soil. Reverend Croft performed the ceremony in the church, which was decorated for the occasion with late-season flowers, including a large armful of the garden sunflowers, which had gone through a second bloom in the September warmth and were the golden color of Colorado autumn light. Mrs. Croft provided a wedding cake that was, according to general consensus and unlike her fruit cake, genuinely excellent. Frank Hollies stood with Edgar. Clara Hendricks, the schoolteacher, who had become Virginia's closest friend over the preceding months, stood with Virginia. The entire town of Dusty Creek was present, which is to say approximately 270 people crowded into a church that comfortably held 150. And nobody complained about the closeness, because the warmth of that many people who were genuinely happy about what they were witnessing was indistinguishable from the warmth of good news. Virginia wore a dress in ivory with a small pattern of blue flowers, not the elaborate kind of wedding dress that required a dressmaker from the city, but a dress she had made herself with considerable skill from fabric she had ordered 3 months earlier from a supplier in Denver who did not know it was for a wedding. She carried a small bunch of herbs from the garden, rosemary and thyme and sage, tied with a ribbon, because she said flowers were for people who did not have a garden full of better things. She was the most beautiful thing Edgar Slater had ever seen in his life, and when she walked up the aisle of that overcrowded church in October sunlight with her dark eyes on him and her chin level, and the ring he had given her already on her hand, he understood with the full clarity of a man who has found the exact right thing after a long search that this was the end of the wandering, not the end of himself. Not the end of the person who had moved through the world and paid attention and noticed things and felt the particular aliveness of forward motion, but the end of the wandering for its own sake, the end of movement as a substitute for living. This was where he was going. He had arrived. He had arrived, and here was Virginia, and here was the garden they had planted together, and here was the town that had become the container of his life. He said "I do" in a voice that was steady and certain, and Virginia said "I do" in a voice that was quiet and firm and completely without hesitation, and Reverend Croft pronounced them married, and Edgar kissed his wife in front of the entire population of Dusty Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1879. After the wedding, they moved Virginia's belongings from the apartment above the store and Edgar's few possessions from the livery cot into the small house, 3 blocks from the store that they had rented as of the 1st of October, a 2-room house with a kitchen and a good stove and a south-facing window, that the light came through in the mornings in a way that Virginia said was the specific quality of light she had always wanted to wake up to. He did not immediately stop sleeping in the livery. The joke wrote itself and Pete Dolan made it, and Edgar took it with the grace of a man who knows when a joke is coming from a place of warmth. The house was theirs, which meant it was the first place in Edgar Slater's adult life that had been his in the full sense of the word, not borrowed, not temporary, not a cot in a back room, but walls and a floor and a roof with his name on the lease alongside Virginia's. He painted the front door blue because she said she had always wanted a blue front door, and she watched him do it from the porch steps with her coffee cup in both hands and a look of private satisfaction that was one of his favorite things about her. That first winter of their marriage was the best winter of both their lives, which is perhaps a counterintuitive thing to say about a Colorado winter, but which was true nonetheless. They were learning the intimate domestic mathematics of sharing a life, the small daily negotiations of space and habit and preference that are either the proving ground of a marriage or its destruction, and they were discovering that they were, in this as in most things, a good fit. Virginia was a methodical morning person who made coffee before she was fully awake and sat with it in the south window for 20 minutes before she was ready to speak. Edgar was a person who woke completely and immediately and had to consciously slow himself down to her morning pace. They found an equilibrium in the first 2 weeks without drama. He started the stove and made the coffee and went out to check on the garden in its winter sleep, and when he came back she was in the south window with her cup and ready to be talked to. It was a small and perfect thing. In January she told him she was pregnant. She said it in the morning in the south window with her coffee cup in her hands, looking at him with those direct dark eyes that now held something new, a complex mixture of wonder and vulnerability, and a specific kind of quiet joy that he had not seen in her before. He sat down beside her in the south window. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked out at the January garden, which was under its winter snow and invisible but present and alive, and he thought about seeds and soil and the things that sleep through winter and come back in spring. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply, "and very happy." "Both of those things make complete sense," he said. "I know," she said. "I am getting better at holding 2 true things at once." He kissed the top of her head and she settled more comfortably against him, and outside the January snow was beginning again, and the window was warm against it, and the garden was there below the white, doing its patient underground work, and everything that mattered was in this room. Their son was born in August of 1880. He came into the world in the small hours of a summer morning with a full set of opinions about the experience, loudly expressed, and with a remarkable quantity of dark hair. "Doctor," Horace Pillinger, who was Dusty Creek's physician and a man of professional calm and personal warmth, declared him healthy and well-formed with the satisfaction of someone who takes genuine pleasure in good outcomes. Virginia held him in the morning light and looked at him with an expression that made Edgar feel, in the most direct and uncomplicated way, that every mile of all those years of drifting had been the road that led to this room. They named him Daniel, after Edgar's brother, because Virginia said that the names of people we have loved and lost deserve to be carried forward, that it is a form of keeping them with you. And Edgar held his son with that name, and felt the old grief not disappear but transform into something that was acknowledgement and memory and love, the way a river transforms when it finds the sea. Daniel Slater grew through his first year with the robust determination of a healthy child and the specific personality of a person who has come into the world with things to investigate. He was a restless, curious, mobile baby who pulled himself upright on furniture at 9 months and walked with experimental lurching purpose at 11, and who developed, by his first birthday, a strong interest in the garden that would become one of the central facts of his childhood. Edgar carried him out to the garden in the mornings and showed him things. He showed him the earthworms that came up after rain, and the beetles that lived under the raised bed planks, and the way a beanpole grew in a spiral. Daniel listened to all of this with his whole body, grabbing at whatever Edgar pointed to, putting dirt in his mouth with the scientific thoroughness of someone who believes that complete investigation requires all available senses. The livery was doing well under Edgar's management. He had taken Frank's advice about the shoeing rates and other small adjustments, and the business had responded with increased volume. Frank Hollies came by most mornings still, sitting on the bench outside the stable door with his coffee, watching the work without managing it, which was exactly the retirement he had wanted. Edgar valued these morning conversations with Frank in a way he had not anticipated. Frank had 40 years of experience with horses and people and the particular economics of a frontier town, and what he shared in these morning conversations was practical wisdom of the kind that you cannot get from books. By 1881, Edgar had increased his ownership stake in the livery to 30% under the terms of their arrangement, and he had also, with Virginia's considerable business acumen brought to bear on the decision, entered into an agreement with the county postal service to use the livery as the mail relay point for the valley, which added a steady and reliable income stream that the livery work alone did not provide. Virginia's general store continued to be what it had always been, the reliable commercial heart of Dusty Creek, but she had expanded it in small ways, adding a broader selection of goods as the town grew, and adding a small corner section of seeds and gardening supplies that Edgar had suggested, and that had proved more popular than either of them expected, because the frontier impulse to grow your own food was strong in people who had lived through uncertain supply chains. And a well-stocked seed selection was something they had lacked. The garden itself had grown in its third year into a genuine feature of the property. Edgar had extended it by negotiating a purchase of the full lot from the county in the spring of 1880, when his provisional lease was up, and Harold Webb at the county assessor's office had confirmed that he had met all the improvement requirements with substantial margin. He owned it outright. He had paid Harold Webb and shaken his hand and ridden back to Dusty Creek with the deed in his pocket, and gone straight to the garden and pressed his palm flat against the soil of the South Strawberry bed the same way he had pressed it against the neglected dirt on the day Virginia told him he would never settle down. His land, his soil, his promise kept. He sat in the garden that evening in October 1880 when the sun was going down, and the air had the sharp, clean smell of autumn, and the vegetable beds were in their end-of-season state, some already cleared and turned, the garlic just planted for its second winter, the kale still producing vigorously. He sat on the stone edging he had built and looked at all of it and thought about the man who had ridden into Dusty Creek with 40 cents in his pocket and no plan. That man had understood, somewhere deeper than thought, that the wandering was not a destination, that it was a condition of incompleteness that mistook motion for fullness. He had not known this consciously, because the grief and the restlessness had not presented themselves as incompleteness but as freedom, and it had taken a woman with dark, direct eyes and a precise pen and an uncompromising honesty to show him the difference. Virginia found him in the garden at dusk and sat beside him on the stone edging with Daniel on her hip, the boy already half asleep with his face against her shoulder. She looked at the garden in the failing light. 2nd October, she said. 2nd October, he agreed. She looked at the garlic rose. Are you going to tell me again that it will come back in spring? It will come back in spring, he said. It always does. She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb the sleeping Daniel between them. I know, she said softly. In the spring of 1882, Otto Brannigan came to visit the garden. He had not been to Dusty Creek in the years since he had sent Edgar back with seeds and instructions and the pamphlet in careful English. Edgar had gone to him twice more, to report on progress and to get additional cuttings and advice, but Otto had not made the 15-mile trip himself. He arrived on a Saturday morning in May when the garden was in its full spring glory, the garlic strong and green, the strawberries blooming, the kale in its second year of robust production alongside the first-year spinach. The raised beds were full, and the sunflowers were planted along the back fence for their 4th season. Otto stood at the stone edging for a long time, looking at all of it without speaking, with the thorough, technical attention of a gardener evaluating another gardener's work. Edgar stood beside him, not speaking, waiting. Otto walked the perimeter. He crouched at the garlic, looking at the spacing and the health of the leaves. He examined the strawberry bed and counted the runners. He looked at the raised beds with their companion plantings, the tomatoes going in alongside the basil, the beans on their poles, the cucumbers beginning to vine. He stood up. He turned to Edgar. Good, he said. From Otto Brannigan, Edgar knew this was the equivalent of a speech. Virginia brought coffee out to the garden, and the three of them sat on the stone edging in the May morning, and talked about soil and seasons, and the particular satisfaction of things that grow. And Otto told them about his own arrival in Colorado from Bavaria 25 years earlier with nothing but his family and a box of seeds, and how the first garden had felt like putting down a root into strange ground and discovering that the soil would hold it. Daniel, at nearly 2, was in the garden with them, his attention cycling between the earthworms he had found under a rock and Otto's bootlaces, which were apparently of scientific interest. Otto watched the boy with the expression of an old man watching a young child in a garden and finding the combination of these things sufficiently good to account for most of what life is supposed to be. He went home in the early afternoon. At the gate of the garden he turned back. The woman said you would not stay, he said to Edgar. She did, Edgar agreed. Otto looked at the garden and then at Virginia, who was standing at Edgar's side with her hand in his. The garden answered her, Otto said simply, and turned and walked to his horse and rode east toward his farm. Virginia looked up at Edgar. He is correct, she said. He usually is, Edgar said. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Daniel chose this moment to arrive at their feet holding an earthworm with the triumphant expression of a person who has discovered something magnificent and wishes the discovery to be recognized. Worm, said Daniel by way of announcement. Yes, said Virginia seriously, crouching down to look at it. It is a very good worm. You found it in the garden. Daniel looked at the worm and then at his mother with an expression of profound satisfaction. In 1883, Virginia gave birth to their second child, a girl they named Eleanor, after Virginia's mother. Eleanor arrived in June with considerably more equanimity than her brother had managed, settling into the world with a placid curiosity that was different from Daniel's restless investigation and was entirely her own. She had Edgar's gray eyes and Virginia's dark hair, and from the beginning seemed to regard everything around her with a calm, attentive interest that was charming and slightly unnerving in an infant. Daniel was 3 when Alina was born, and received her arrival with mixed feelings that resolved over the following months into a protective older brother attachment that expressed itself primarily as showing Alina things in the garden and explaining them at length, regardless of Alina's developmental capacity to receive the explanation. The garden was now a genuine community resource. Virginia sold the surplus through the store and donated a portion to the church's distribution program, which provided food assistance to families who had fallen on hard times, of which there were always some. Dusty Creek was growing in these years, the railroad coming closer and the ranching operations expanding and new families arriving every season, and the town was taking on more of the solidity and less of the frontier impermanence that had characterized its earlier years. Edgar had bought out Frank Hollis's remaining interest in the livery in 1882, when Frank's health had declined to the point where even the morning visits were becoming difficult. He paid Frank a fair price over 18 months in installments, and Frank retired completely, moving into Mrs. Croft's spare room with the quiet gratitude of a man who has found a soft landing after a long, hard road. Frank Hollis died peacefully in the winter of 1884 at the age of 67, and Edgar spoke at his funeral, briefly and with genuine feeling, about what it meant to be taken seriously by a man who had no reason to take you seriously, and how that single act of trust had been one of the foundational stones of everything that came after. The livery bore a small painted sign by 1885 that read Slater Livery and Postal Relay, and it employed 2 full-time stable hands and a part-time farrier who came in twice a week, which was a modest enterprise by any measure, but was Edgar Slater's enterprise, built from 40 cents and a provisional lease and a garden in a vacant lot. Virginia's store had expanded in 1884 into the adjacent space on the other side, a small room that had been rented by a tailor who moved to Denver, and the expanded store now carried a full hardware section and an expanded dry goods selection that served the growing population and the outlying farms and ranches that made the 40-mile trip to Dusty Creek for their supplies. They were, by any measure, successful. They were, by every measure that mattered, happy. Not in the uncomplicated way of people who have not known loss or difficulty or the particular wear of daily life, but in the deep, durable way of people who have built something together with full knowledge of what it costs and full willingness to pay it. They disagreed about things. They had the occasional argument that was real and direct in the way that the arguments of honest people are, without concealment or indirection, and they resolved them in the same way because they had both learned that the cost of unresolved things is higher than the cost of the difficult conversation. Virginia still had the habit of tapping her pen twice on the ledger when she was about to say something she had decided to say, but was still somewhat reluctant to say. Edgar still had the restless morning energy that had to be consciously slowed to meet her pace. These were not problems. They were the particular texture of the people they were, and the people they were had chosen each other with full knowledge of these textures. In the garden, the 4th year of strawberries was producing so abundantly that Virginia made 3 batches of preserves in a single week, and still had enough left to sell through the store in small mason jars with handwritten paper labels that became, according to Pete Dolan, the most popular single item she sold. The sunflowers were in their 5th year of planting, and had become a feature that people commented on when they came to Dusty Creek, the tall golden row along the back fence visible from the street, and giving the corner lot a character that was both practical and unexpectedly beautiful. Otto Brannigan came back to visit in the summer of 1885, this time bringing his granddaughter, a girl of 10 named Liesel who had inherited his love of growing things, and who conducted herself through the garden with the reverent attention of a junior colleague. Edgar showed her everything, the companion plantings and the compost system he had developed, and the particular way he had arranged the beds to catch maximum sun at this elevation and latitude. And Liesl listened, with the concentrated focus of a child who is hearing something that will become important to her life. Virginia watched this from the store doorway, her arms crossed but not in the defensive way, in the comfortable observational way, and her expression was the one that Edgar had come to know as her version of profound contentment, the expression she wore when things were exactly as they should be. On a September afternoon in 1885, 7 years after Edgar Slater had ridden into Dusty Creek with 40 cents in his pocket, he was in the garden with Daniel, now 5, who was helping him put in the fall garlic with the focused assistance of a child who has been doing something since before he can remember and considers it as natural as breathing. "Deeper," Edgar said when Daniel pressed a garlic clove only partway into the soil. "Like this." Daniel pushed it into the proper depth with his small forefinger. "Exactly like that," Edgar said. Daniel looked at the planted clove and then at his father. "It will come back in spring," he said with the tone of a child reciting something he knows but still finds pleasurable to confirm. "It always does," Edgar said. "Even when there is snow on it," Daniel said. "Even then," Edgar said. "It sleeps under the snow and comes back when it is ready." Daniel considered this with the philosophical seriousness that 5-year-olds bring to botanical facts. Virginia came out of the store and walked to the garden's edge with a leaner on her hip, 16 months old and regarding the world with her characteristic calm interest. She watched her husband and son planting garlic in the September afternoon, and there was something in her face that was so complete, so entirely resolved from the uncertainty and the fear and the dark past of leaving men, that it was as if none of that had ever lived in her. It had. Edgar knew it had. The healing was real precisely because the wound had been real. She looked at him across the garden in the September light. "Second batch of strawberry preserves from this morning sold out before noon," she said. "We need more strawberry plants," he said. "I agree," she said. "I will plant more along the south edge this fall," he said. "Good," she said. Daniel looked up from the garlic bed. "I can help," he announced. "You always help," Virginia told him, which was true and clearly the right thing to say because Daniel returned to his planting with renewed purpose. Edgar looked at Virginia, and she looked at him across the September garden, with the late afternoon light gold between them and a leaner small hand, patting Virginia's shoulder and Daniel's dark head bent over the garlic rows, and the sunflowers tall against the back fence, and the smell of sage and thyme in the warm air. He thought about the man who had ridden into this town with 40 cents and no plan. He thought about a woman who had said 5 words from a porch that had changed the direction of everything. He thought about seeds pressed into October soil, and the long winter faith required to believe they would come back. He thought about the specific courage it takes to stay, when you have moved for so long that movement feels like the natural state of things, when the road is familiar and the staying is the unknown territory, the wilderness that requires real navigation. He had navigated it. They had navigated it together. And here was the garden, 7 years deep in this soil, come back every spring from under every winter with the patient, unargumentative conviction of things that are well-rooted and well-tended. Here were the strawberries and the garlic and the herbs along the wall and the sunflowers facing their faithful heads toward the light. Here was Daniel planting garlic with his small hands. Here was Alina with her calm gray eyes on the world. Here was Virginia. Here was everything. Edgar Slater pressed his palm flat against the warm September soil of the garden, the same gesture he had made 7 years ago on a different patch of this same ground, and felt the living earth and the deep root systems and the sleeping seeds and the whole long patience of it against his skin. He was home. He had always been going to come home. He just had not known, until a woman on a porch in October of 1878 told him he would never settle down. That home was a thing you planted. And every spring, without fail, without doubt, it came back.